Welcome to Sinister Truths, the channel where dark history, hidden stories, and unsettling realities come to light. Before we begin, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. And make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling story. In the rolling hills of Virginia, where the sun dipped slowly over fields of tobacco and cotton, the plantation of the Montrose family stood as a symbol of wealth, power, and tradition. It was a sprawling estate, with white columns that gleamed in the morning light and rows of magnolia trees that lined the long carriage drive. Every detail of the estate, from the manicured gardens to the servants bustling in the background, spoke of generations of privilege and the carefully cultivated reputation of the Montrose family. At the heart of this grandeur was Isabella Montrose, the young heiress whose beauty and status had long made her the subject of admiration, envy, and quiet intrigue among the elite of Virginia. Isabella was the only daughter of Edward Montrose, a man whose fortune had been built over decades through the acquisition of land, plantations, and the labor of hundreds of enslaved people. Her mother Beatrice had died when Isabella was still a child, leaving her in the care of a stern yet indulgent father. Edward Montrose believed in maintaining appearances at all costs, ensuring that his daughter's education, poise, and social standing were impeccable. Isabella, in turn, was molded into a figure who could walk into any ballroom, any social gathering, and command attention without uttering a word. Her presence was both luminous and intimidating, a testament to the power her family wielded in the region. From an early age, Isabella understood the duality of her world. On one hand, she was surrounded by luxury, gilded furniture, endless gowns of silk and lace, horses that were pampered like royalty, and servants who anticipated her every need. She learned to play the piano flawlessly, to dance elegantly, and to converse with a grace that made her a jewel among Virginia's elite. On the other hand, she was constantly reminded of her place atop a rigid social hierarchy that depended upon the suffering and subjugation of others. Slavery was not an abstract concept for Isabella, it was the rhythm of her daily life. She witnessed the harshness of labor in the fields, the quiet despair of those who served in the household, and the unyielding control her father held over every life on the plantation. Despite the rigid structure surrounding her, Isabella possessed a restless curiosity and a keen intellect. She would wander the edges of the estate, watching the enslaved people working under the unforgiving sun, noting their movements, their expressions, and the subtle forms of communication they used to endure their lives. Though she was the product of a society that treated them as property, Isabella could not help but feel a complicated fascination with these individuals. She observed them with a mixture of detachment and intrigue, aware that their existence was inseparably tied to her own comfort and status. Yet, even in her gilded cage, Isabella yearned for companionship that went beyond the shallow camaraderie of other young women at the PLA. Plantation balls. Her father ensured that she was always surrounded by well-bred company, young men of wealth, daughters of prominent families, but true friendship was rarer, almost a secret treasure in a world dominated by social expectation and performance. This desire for genuine connection led her to form an unusually close bond with Catherine Langley, a neighbor's daughter who was clever, daring, and equally accustomed to the privileges of wealth. Where Isabella was composed and calculating, Catherine was lively and impulsive. Their personalities complemented each other perfectly, and from a young age they became inseparable. They shared secrets, explored the edges of their estates together, and reveled in the minor rebellions that only girls of privilege could afford, sneaking out to the woods, whispering forbidden thoughts, and imagining a world beyond the constraints imposed by their families. As Isabella grew into adolescence, her beauty and intelligence became more pronounced. She had the sharp, arched eyebrows of her mother, the clear blue eyes that seemed to scrutinize everything around her, and a voice that carried a melodic authority. Hall echoed with laughter and discussion of land deals, marriages, and politics. The library smelled of old leather and ink, filled with books that taught history, philosophy, and the sciences. The music rooms resonated with piano melodies and harpsichord harmonies, reflecting refinement and culture. Yet just beyond the polished floors and crystal chandeliers lay the servants' quarters, humble, crowded, and silent witnesses to the human cost of the Montrose fortune. Isabella's education included an awareness of these dualities, though her youthful mind often struggled to reconcile the elegance she cherished with the suffering she observed. It was in this complex environment that Isabella's personality was fully shaped. a combination of grace, intelligence, curiosity, and a hint of ruthlessness. She was admired and envied in equal measure, capable of charm that could disarm and a subtle cunning that could intimidate. But beneath the exterior perfection was a restless spirit, one that sought not only social dominance but also the thrill of secret knowledge, the fascination with lives beyond her own, and the intoxicating allure of forbidden attachments. These qualities, nurtured in the privileged halls of Montrose estate, would ultimately define the path of her later actions, the friendships she formed, the obsessions she indulged, and the tragedies that would eventually unfold. By the time Isabella reached her late teens, she was no longer just a beautiful heiress, she was a force to be reckoned with. Her father's fortune, the social standing of her family, and her personal charm gave her a rare combination of influence and opportunity. It was during these years that the stage was being quietly set for the arrival of a particular enslaved individual whose presence would ignite desires, rivalries, and jealousies that even Isabella could not fully anticipate. The Montrose estate, with its grandeur and hidden darkness, had prepared her for everything, and yet nothing at all. The heiress's world was a world of contrasts, beauty and cruelty, loyalty and betrayal, fascination and fear. It was a world in which every smile could conceal a motive, every gesture could carry power, and every glance could provoke desire or envy. And it was within this intricate tapestry that Isabella Montrose's story truly began, a story that would intertwine privilege, obsession, and tragedy in ways she could never have foreseen. The summer of Isabella Montrose's 19th year was unusually hot, the kind of Virginia summer where the sun seemed to settle into the very skin, making even the simplest of tasks feel like labor. On the Montrose estate, the air was thick with the mingled scents of blooming jasmine, sun-baked earth, and the smoke from the distant tobacco kilns. Life carried on in its usual rhythm, servants moving quietly through the halls, gardeners tending meticulously to the sprawling grounds, and Isabella preparing for the upcoming social season with her cuss. Tomery, poise, and grace, yet that summer would bring a change so profound that it would ripple through the carefully ordered lives of all who inhabited the estate, a change that began with the arrival of a young man named Samuel. Samuel was not just any enslaved individual. He had been purchased from a neighboring plantation by Edward Montrose under the guise of strengthening the household staff. In truth, the acquisition had been influenced by Isabella herself. Edward, prideful and indulgent when it came to his daughter, had allowed her to select the new addition to the estate's workforce, believing it a harmless exercise of her emerging influence. Isabella had chosen Samuel for reasons that were difficult even for her to articulate fully. He was strikingly tall, with shoulders that hinted at strength and agility, eyes dark and observant, and a quiet confidence that distinguished him from the many enslaved individuals who had passed through the Montrose estate over the years. There was something about him that drew her attention, an aura of presence that could not be ignored. When Samuel arrived on the estate, he was brought in a covered wagon, accompanied by 2 overseers from his previous plantation. The journey had been long and exhausting, and he arrived with the posture of one who had endured much yet remained unbroken in spirit. Isabella was waiting at the grand front entrance, her skirts rustling softly in the humid breeze, her gaze sharp as she appraised him silently. It was, she later admitted, a moment of curiosity mingled with anticipation. She could not yet articulate why she felt the need to observe him so closely, only that the very sight of him set something in motion she did not fully understand. The introduction was formal and restrained. Samuel was instructed to bow, to speak only when spoken to, and to present himself as respectful and compliant. Edward Montrose, as ever, oversaw the interaction with a detached sense of authority. He introduced the young man to the estate's hierarchy, explaining his role in the kitchen, in the fields, and occasionally within the main house. Samuel's responses were measured, polite but cautious, revealing a mind that was quick and attentive. Isabella noted the way he surveyed the surroundings, his eyes taking in the grandeur of the estate, the bustle of the servants, and the subtleties of power that governed the Montrose household. There was intelligence there, she thought, and perhaps even an understanding of the invisible rules that dictated the lives of those who lived under the weight of ownership and expectation. As the days passed, Samuel began to adapt to his new surroundings, performing his assigned duties with quiet efficiency. He worked in the household, tending to tasks that ranged from cleaning and maintenance to attending to guests during social gatherings. Yet it was not simply his labor that distinguished him in Isabella's eyes. It was the way he carried himself, the subtle confidence, and the way he seemed to understand the unspoken rules of the estate without question. Isabella watched him carefully, noting the smallest gestures, the way he moved when servants passed by, the way he addressed the overseers, the way his eyes lingered on the details of the house and its inhabitants. For Isabella, Samuel's arrival opened a new world of fascination. She began to orchestrate moments where she could observe him more closely, sending him on errands that brought him into the main house, asking him to perform tasks under her supervision, and engaging him in brief conversations about his previous experiences. These interactions were always polite, never overtly personal, yet they allowed Isabella a window into a life so different from her own. In Samuel's presence, she felt a mix of power, intrigue, and an inexplicable curiosity that compelled her to learn more about him. But the arrival of Samuel also stirred the dynamics of the Montrose household in ways Isabella had not fully anticipated. The other servants observed the new addition with a mixture of caution and suspicion. They whispered among themselves, noting his height, his strength, and the subtle air of authority he carried even in submission. Some were wary, fearing that his presence might disrupt the established order. Others were quietly envious, sensing a talent and intelligence in Samuel that set him apart from the majority of the enslaved individuals at Montrose. Isabella noticed these reactions, and found herself both amused and intrigued by the undercurrents of rivalry and observation. It was during one of these early weeks that Catherine Langley, Isabella's closest friend, arrived at the estate for her summer stay. Catherine was radiant and full of energy, her laughter a sharp contrast to Isabella's composed demeanor. She had been briefed on the arrival of Samuel but had no real understanding of the effect he would have on the household, or on Isabella herself. The first meeting between Catherine and Samuel was brief, polite, and marked by a mutual acknowledgement of the social hierarchy. Yet, even in that short encounter, Catherine sensed that Isabella's attention was unusually focused, her eyes following Samuel with an intensity that was almost palpable. Over the course of the summer, the relationship between Isabella and Samuel evolved in subtle ways. Isabella began to grant him small privileges not afforded to the other servants, a slightly later hour to retire at night, brief moments of conversation beyond what was strictly necessary, and occasional tasks that allowed him to move freely within the main house. She watched closely how he responded, noting the deference in his speech, the intelligence in his observations, and the composure with which he navigated the complex web of authority surrounding him. These privileges were small in the grand scheme of the plantation, yet they were enough to set Samuel apart, to make him a figure of fascination not only for Isabella, but eventually for Catherine as well. It was not long before Catherine, too, began to notice Samuel in a way that went beyond mere curiosity. She observed his strength, his quiet confidence, and the way he seemed to carry himself with dignity, despite the constraints placed upon him. Catherine's interest, initially casual, soon became tinged with a mixture of admiration and desire. She began seeking opportunities to interact with him, sometimes under Isabella's watchful eye, sometimes when she thought she was unobserved. These interactions were charged with subtle tension, a mixture of the forbidden, the curious, and the socially dangerous. Isabella, for her part, was not blind to Catherine's growing fascination. At first, she felt a sense of pride in her ability to draw such attention to her selection, as though her judgment in choosing Samuel had been validated. Yet, she also experienced a stir of possessiveness, a subtle unease at the thought that someone else might claim the attention and loyalty of the young man she had observed so carefully. It was a feeling that Isabella had rarely experienced, a mix of ownership, fascination, and the nascent stirrings of jealousy that would later become central to the story. As the summer heat continued to press down on the estate, the household settled into a delicate balance. Samuel performed his duties with diligence, Isabella watched with curiosity and growing intrigue, and Catherine began to maneuver herself closer to both the household and Samuel's attention. Outside observers, other members of the Montrose family, neighbors and local socialites, saw only the surface, a well-run estate, a charming young heiress, and the usual rhythm of plantation life. They did not see the subtle games of attention, desire, and control unfolding behind closed doors. It was during one long afternoon, as the sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Montrose library, that Isabella realized the full extent of her own fascination with Samuel. She had asked him to retrieve a ledger from the far end of the room, a task simple enough in execution but significant in consequence. As he moved through the space, his movements precise and deliberate, Isabella felt a curious thrill, a mixture of authority, admiration, and something she could not yet name. The realization startled her. She understood that Samuel's presence had awakened a desire within her for control, attention, and perhaps even possession, a desire that went beyond the ordinary relationships between master and servant. By the end of that summer, the stage was fully set. Samuel had become more than just a new member of the household. He was a figure around whom attention, rivalry, and fascination would revolve. Isabella's observations had sharpened into a focused interest. Catherine's curiosity had developed into desire, and the delicate balance of the Montrose estate had shifted in subtle, irreversible ways. What began as the simple arrival of a young enslaved man had become the catalyst for complex emotions, jealousy, obsession, and the dangerous allure of forbidden attachments. In retrospect, the arrival of Samuel marked the beginning of a transformation within the Montrose household. He was a silent agent of change, unaware of the impact he had on the young women who watched him so closely, unaware of the conflicts that would soon arise, and unaware of the tragic consequences that his presence would ultimately set into motion. The summer ended, the fields ripened under the Virginia sun, and life on the Montrose estate continued in its outwardly orderly fashion. Yet beneath the polished veneer, the invisible threads of tension, desire, and rivalry had already begun to weave a web from which none of the household's inhabitants would emerge unscathed. The story of Isabella, Catherine, and Samuel had truly begun, and it was a story destined to explore the darkest corners of human obsession, the complexities of power, and the perilous interplay of desire, possession, and jealousy. Catherine Langley arrived at the Montrose estate at the end of July, her carriage rattling along the long, dusty drive that cut through the rolling Virginia hills. Summer was at its peak, the air heavy with humidity, the fields glowing gold under the relentless sun. Catherine's arrival was always a highly anticipated event. She and Isabella had been inseparable since childhood, a pair whose connection seemed both unbreakable and incomprehensible to the other girls of their social circle. Their bond was not born solely of convenience or shared status. It was deeper, a friendship formed through shared secrets, laughter whispered under the shade of magnolia trees, and daring escapades beyond the watchful eyes of guardians and tutors. From the moment Catherine stepped out of her carriage, the interplay between the two friends began as it always did. Isabella, poised and calculating, observed every nuance of Catherine's expression, noting the slight flush of excitement in her cheeks, the glimmer of mischief in her eyes, and the rapid scanning of the familiar estate that had once been her own private world. Catherine, in turn, let herself be momentarily overwhelmed by the grandeur of Montrose, by the scent of the flowering gardens, the polished halls, and the subtle signs of luxury at every turn. She embraced her friend with an affection that was both exuberant and intimate, their laughter echoing through the hallways, a sound that had long been absent from the estate in any such unguarded form. Yet Catherine's arrival marked more than just the reunion of two lifelong friends. It coincided with the presence of Samuel, whose arrival had already begun to shift the dynamics within the Montrose household. Catherine had heard rumors of him during her journey, tales whispered in passing by neighbors or servants about the new addition to the estate, but seeing him in person, witnessing the quiet strength and poise with which he carried himself, ignited a fascination that was immediate and, as it would turn out, increasingly dangerous. At first, Catherine's interactions with Samuel were cautious and polite. She'd been raised to understand the rigid hierarchies of her society and the consequences of crossing those boundaries. She spoke to him with measured warmth, never overstepping the roles assigned to each of them. Yet, her natural curiosity, combined with her playful and daring personality, made it inevitable that she would seek opportunities to observe and interact with him beyond mere duty. She began noticing the way he moved silently through the hallways, the glint of intelligence in his eyes, and the ease with which he adapted to the subtle rules of the Montrose household, rules that often went unnoticed by the other servants. Isabella, ever attentive, quickly recognized the spark of interest in her friend. A thrill coursed through her at the thought that someone else had noticed what she herself had been observing for weeks: the presence, the poise, the quiet magnetism of Samuel. But alongside this thrill, there was a flicker of unease. Isabella's curiosity had always been her own, an almost private indulgence. The idea that Catherine might also draw attention to Samuel introduced an unfamiliar tension into their friendship, a subtle but persistent tug that would eventually grow into something far more dangerous. The first days of Catherine's stay passed in a mixture of leisure and observation. The two friends spent long afternoons wandering the gardens, visiting the stables, and exploring the edges of the estate where the sunlight dappled the ground through the leaves. In these moments, their conversations often circled back to Samuel, though always indirectly at first. "He seems different," Catherine remarked one afternoon as they rested beneath the sprawling branches of a magnolia tree. "There's something about him I can't quite put into words." Isabella's eyes narrowed slightly, a small, almost imperceptible reaction. "Different how?" she asked, careful to sound casual. Catherine hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know. Strong, yes, but there's a presence, like he notices everything." Isabella nodded slowly, masking the surge of possessiveness she felt, and changed the topic, though the words lingered in the humid air. As the days turned into weeks, Catherine began to test the boundaries of her interactions with Samuel. She asked him to assist with tasks in the main house, claiming curiosity about how the estate functioned. She lingered near him during meals, found excuses to speak with him briefly, and even sought opportunities to observe him during private moments, such as when he polished silverware or prepared rooms for guests. Samuel responded to her attention with the same measured politeness he had shown Isabella, maintaining a careful balance between respect and subtle self-possession. The growing triangle of attention, Isabella, Catherine, and Samuel, was a delicate dance. Isabella had introduced Samuel to the household, had allowed him privileges that no other servant enjoyed, and had cultivated a sense of fascination that bordered on obsession. Catherine, with her natural charm and boldness, now threatened to intrude upon that private interest. Isabella felt a stir of jealousy she had never experienced before. It was not merely envy of Catherine's attention toward Samuel. It was the fear of losing control over something she had come to regard as her own, a mix of fascination and possessiveness that was entirely new and disquieting. Despite this tension, the two friends maintained an outward appearance of harmony. Catherine's charm and wit complemented Isabella's calculated poise, and together, they became the center of social activity on the estate. But beneath the surface, the first threads of rivalry were being spun. Isabella began to orchestrate interactions with Samuel more deliberately, assigning tasks that would bring him into proximity with her while subtly guiding Catherine's encounters to less consequential moments. Catherine, perceptive as ever, noticed these maneuvers, but chose to respond with playful defiance rather than open confrontation, a strategy that both amused and frustrated Isabella in equal measure. The household staff, too, began to sense the subtle shifts in dynamics. Other servants whispered quietly about the attention Samuel received from the young ladies, noting the unusual privileges he enjoyed and the delicate tension that seemed to linger whenever Isabella and Catherine were together. Some were curious, some wary, and some quietly entertained by the unfolding drama, yet all were careful to maintain the decorum expected in the presence of their young mistresses. The plantation, with all its rigid hierarchies and codes of conduct, had become a stage for a social drama that was both invisible to outsiders and intensely potent to those who lived within its walls. One evening, as the sun set over the distant hills, Isabella invited Catherine to join her in the drawing room. The room was cool and dimly lit by the fading light, the air heavy with the scent of roses brought in from the gardens. Samuel had been tasked with preparing refreshments, and his presence in the room, quietly moving to lay out trays of fruit and sweetmeats, was both necessary and provocative. Catherine watched him with an intensity that Isabella could not ignore, her gaze lingering longer than polite observation dictated. Isabella felt a pang of possessiveness, sharp and unfamiliar, and decided that she would need to assert her attention in subtle ways to maintain the balance she sought. The tension between the two friends over Samuel was subtle at first, a glance held too long, a question phrased in a particular way, a deliberate choice of seating or proximity. But these small acts accumulated, creating an invisible current of competition that neither Catherine nor Isabel could fully ignore. What had begun as casual fascination for both women was evolving into a complex interplay of desire, control, and rivalry, each testing the limits of social boundaries while maintaining the veneer of propriety expected in their world. Isabella, ever strategic, began to experiment with ways to keep Samuel close while limiting Catherine's access. She assigned him tasks that required his presence near her, arranged for conversations that allowed her to observe his reactions, and subtly redirected Catherine's attention to less immediate matters. Catherine, for her part, responded with a mixture of charm and subtle defiance, using her wit and social intuition to navigate the delicate terrain. Each interaction became a careful negotiation, a silent contest of influence and attention that neither could openly acknowledge. As the summer progressed, the foundation of the conflict that would ultimately shape their story was laid. The Montrose estate, with its grandeur, its hidden corridors, and its servants moving silently through the background, had become a microcosm for a more profound struggle, one of desire, jealousy, and the complicated interplay of power and possession. Samuel's presence had introduced an element of unpredictability, a catalyst for emotions that neither Isabella nor Catherine fully understood, yet both were compelled to respond to. By the time the first hints of autumn appeared, the air cooling slightly, the fields beginning to take on the muted tones of harvest, Isabella and Catherine's friendship had been irrevocably altered. The bond they had shared since childhood remained, but it was now layered with complexity, tension, and unspoken competition. Samuel was no longer merely a new addition to the household. He was the focal point of fascination, desire, and subtle rivalry, a presence that illuminated both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the two young women. The arrival of the best friend, Catherine, had changed everything. What began as a joyful reunion became a delicate dance of observation, influence, and possessiveness. The stage was set for the conflicts, jealousies, and ultimately tragic consequences that would emerge in the months to come. And as the sun set over the rolling Virginia hills, casting long shadows across the Montrose estate, an invisible tension hung in the air, one that would grow, deepen, and eventually consume all those involved. By the time late summer rolled into early autumn, the Montrose estate had settled into its usual rhythm of quiet elegance and hidden tensions. Isabella and Catherine, though outwardly inseparable, now navigated a more delicate balance in their friendship, each subtly aware of the fascination they both shared for Samuel, the young enslaved man who had become the unspoken center of their attention. What began as casual observation and polite curiosity had now evolved into something far more potent, a shared secret, a private knowledge that bound the two free. NDS together while simultaneously threatening the foundation of their loyalty to each other. It began innocuously enough. One afternoon, while Catherine assisted Isabella in preparing the drawing room for a small gathering of neighbors, the two of them watched Samuel as he carefully polished the silver candlesticks and arranged the delicate porcelain tea set. His movements were precise, deliberate, and entirely self-contained. Yet there was a quiet elegance to the way he performed each task that neither young woman could ignore. Isabella's eyes lingered on him longer than necessary, noting the subtle tension in his muscles and the careful grace with which he carried himself. Catherine, standing beside her, felt a similar pull, a mix of admiration and intrigue that made her pulse quicken. It was then, almost simultaneously, that both girls realized they were witnessing the same private fascination. They exchanged a glance, a fleeting acknowledgement of an unspoken understanding. Samuel was no longer just a servant, he had become a figure around whom their curiosity and attention coalesced. That moment, fleeting and delicate, marked the birth of the shared secret. From that day forward, Samuel's presence was no longer merely a matter of household routine. He became a private, almost sacred focus of attention, a source of fascination that neither Isabella nor Catherine would openly discuss with anyone else. The secret itself was complicated. In a household governed by strict hierarchies, where the roles of master and servant were clear and unquestionable, Isabella and Catherine's fascination bordered on taboo. To feel desire, curiosity, or even an emotional attachment toward an enslaved individual was to acknowledge an impulse that society deemed improper, even dangerous. Yet, in the private confines of their shared spaces, the gardens, the drawing room, the hidden alcoves of the estate, they allowed themselves to explore these feelings in silence. Their shared secret was a delicate balance. They did not speak of it aloud, yet it shaped their interactions, their laughter, and even their silences. At first, the secret served to deepen their friendship. The knowledge that they both shared an interest in Samuel created an intimacy beyond the ordinary. They confided in each other in subtle ways, exchanging glances, gestures, and coded phrases that only they could understand. It was a bond forged in curiosity and desire, a shared understanding of something unspoken that simultaneously thrilled and unnerved them. They would whisper observations about Samuel's behavior, debate the meaning of his expressions, and speculate about the hidden depths of his character. These exchanges, innocent in their surface appearance, were charged with an intensity that neither had experienced before, yet, as the secret deepened, so too did the complexities of their feelings. Isabella, who had long been accustomed to controlling the dynamics of her social world, found hers. Unsettled by Catherine's growing boldness in observing Samuel. Catherine's playful curiosity, once a source of amusement, now provoked a subtle sense of possessiveness in Isabella. She began to notice the way Catherine lingered near Samuel during tasks, the way her eyes followed him with a mixture of admiration and longing, and the slight excitement in her voice when she spoke of his presence. Isabella's fascination, previously private and controlled, now collided with the awareness that someone else, someone she trusted implicitly, shared the same focus of attention. Catherine, for her part, was equally aware of the delicate tension. She recognized Isabella's subtle claims over Samuel, the ways in which her friend would maneuver the household to ensure that he was near her, and the slight edge in Isabella's tone whenever Samuel's attention strayed. Yet Catherine was not deterred. Her curiosity and desire were too strong, and the thrill of participating in the shared secret with Isabella added a layer of excitement to her fascination. The secret became a game of observation, a quiet competition that neither could openly acknowledge but which informed every interaction, every glance, and every decision within the estate's walls. The shared secret also altered Samuel's role within the household in ways he could not have anticipated. While he remained dutiful, polite, and attentive to his tasks, the subtle shifts in attention from Isabella and Catherine created a new dynamic. Their curiosity, their fascination, and the private tension they shared imbued his presence with significance beyond his assigned duties. He became a silent participant in a drama that unfolded without his knowledge, a focal point of desire and intrigue that would shape the lives of the young women in profound and irreversible ways. This secret, however, was fragile. Its power lay in its subtlety, in the way it existed without being spoken aloud. One careless word, one unguarded moment, could unravel the delicate balance and expose the hidden currents of desire and jealousy that now ran beneath the surface of the Montrose household. Isabella and Catherine both understood this implicitly. They navigated the estate with caution, orchestrating their interactions with Samuel so that the fascination remained contained, yet always present. They shared smiles, glances, and private jokes that reinforced the secrecy, creating an invisible thread that tied them together, even as it sowed the seeds of potential conflict. Over the course of the season, the shared secret began to influence the behavior of both young women in increasingly pronounced ways. Isabella, whose curiosity had always been disciplined by her need for control, found herself taking deliberate steps to assert her influence over Samuel's attention. She assigned him tasks that required proximity, engaged him in conversation that was subtly more personal than necessary, and observed his reactions with meticulous care. Catherine, equally intelligent and perceptive, responded with a combination of playfulness and determination. She found moments to interact with Samuel in ways that tested the boundaries of propriety, using charm, wit, and subtle gestures to elicit his attention. The interplay of fascination, desire, and competition created a tension that was palpable yet unspoken. The shared secret became a private world unto itself, a place where Isabella and Catherine explored feelings and impulses that society forbade them to express openly. It was a delicate balance of trust and rivalry, a game of observation and influence that deepened their bond while simultaneously planting the seeds of jealousy and conflict. Each glance, each interaction with Samuel, was laden with significance, a silent acknowledgement of the invisible hierarchy that now existed not just within the household, but within their friendship as well. As autumn approached, the shared secret reached new levels of intensity. Isabella and Catherine began to orchestrate encounters with Samuel that allowed for closer observation and subtle interaction. They lingered in the same rooms, created opportunities for conversation, and even allowed themselves brief moments of unspoken communication through glances and gestures. Samuel, unaware of the full extent of their fascination, continued to fulfill his duties with precision and dignity, unknowingly participating in a social drama that would soon spiral beyond anyone's control. The shared secret also carried with it a growing sense of danger. Both Isabella and Catherine understood, in the back of their minds, that their fascination with Samuel could lead to jealousy, conflict, and ultimately heartbreak. Yet the allure was irresistible. The secret had become a source of power, excitement, and identity, a private world in which they could explore impulses and desires that society demanded they suppress. The more they engaged with it, the more they became entangled in the web of observation, possession, and subtle rivalry that now defined their summer. By the end of the season, it was clear that the shared secret was no longer merely a curiosity or a game. It had become a force that shaped the behavior, thoughts, and emotions of both young women. Isabella and Catherine were bound together by it, yet also set on a collision course that neither could foresee in full. Samuel, silent and dutiful, remained at the center, unaware of the intensity his presence had inspired. The Montrose estate, with its grandeur, its hidden corridors, and its ordered routines, had become a stage for a private drama of desire, jealousy, and obsession, one that would only grow in complexity and danger as the months passed. And so the summer faded, the air crisping with the approach of autumn, and the Montrose household settled into a rhythm that appeared outwardly unchanged. Yet beneath the polished surfaces, the laughter, and the polite routines, the shared secret had woven itself into the very fabric of Isabella and Catherine's lives. It was a secret that bound them together, even as it set them on a path toward rivalry and tragedy. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the invisible currents of fascination, jealousy, and desire had begun to move with a force that would soon prove irresistible. As the Montrose estate settled into the rhythms of late autumn, the air cooling and the leaves turning gold and crimson, the dynamics between Isabella, Catherine, and Samuel grew increasingly charged. What had once been a subtle fascination, a shared secret that bound the two friends together, began to shift under the pressure of human emotion. The invisible threads of desire and curiosity now carried the first sparks of jealousy, small, almost imperceptible at first, yet potent enough to alter behavior, thought, and intention. Isabella had always prided herself on her composure. She understood the rules of social engagement, the delicate balance between authority and charm, and the subtle exercise of influence. Yet Catherine's presence, combined with the growing attention that both young women paid to Samuel, began to challenge her self-control in unexpected ways. She noticed the way Catherine's eyes lingered on him, the slight tilt of her head when he passed by, and the playful tone she used in conversation, tones Isabella had carefully avoided. These small gestures, seemingly innocent, ignited a surge of possessiveness in Isabella, a feeling she had not anticipated and struggled to suppress. Catherine, in turn, was fully aware of the subtle tension in Isabella's demeanor. She sensed the quick glances, the slight stiffening of posture, and the occasional sharpness in Isabella's voice when Samuel was near. Far from deterring her, this awareness seemed to fuel Catherine's boldness. There was a thrill in testing the limits of propriety, in exploring the boundaries of friendship, and in seeing how far she could draw Samuel's attention without overtly challenging the social norms that bound them. Each interaction became a delicate game of observation and influence, where a glance or a word could shift the balance of power between the two friends. The first true signs of jealousy emerged during a crisp afternoon in the gardens. Isabella had asked Samuel to assist in preparing a small tea for her and Catherine, arranging the tables and placing delicate porcelain cups with precise care. Catherine lingered nearby, commenting on the arrangement with casual enthusiasm, her hand occasionally brushing against Samuel's as she adjusted a napkin or lifted a teacup. Isabella felt a surge of irritation, a sharp, almost physical pang that she could not ignore. The simple act of Catherine's touch, unremarkable in isolation, now carried with it an undercurrent of threat, a reminder that Samuel's presence was no longer hers alone, even if he did not belong to either of them. Isabella's response was subtle yet deliberate. She began to orchestrate moments that would draw Samuel closer to herself, asking for his help in ways that required his attention, positioning herself in his line of sight, and engaging him in conversation that was slightly more personal than necessary. Each of these actions was calculated to assert influence without overtly challenging Catherine's presence. Yet Catherine, perceptive and clever, noticed these maneuvers. She countered with her own gestures, lingering in proximity, speaking with playful familiarity, and testing the boundaries of social propriety in ways that highlighted her awareness of Isabella's intentions. The tension between the two friends was not immediate or explosive, it was a slow burn, a series of subtle escalations that accumulated over days and weeks. Small incidents, almost imperceptible to an outsider, became loaded with significance. A glance held too long, a slight touch, a carefully chosen word, all became tools in a quiet contest of attention and influence. The shared secret, once a source of intimacy and fascination, had transformed into a delicate balance of rivalry, each girl testing the other while simultaneously negotiating the unspoken rules of their friendship. One afternoon, the sparks of jealousy ignited more visibly during a gathering of neighbors at the Montrose estate. The drawing room was alive with conversation, the clinking of teacups, and the soft strains of a piano in the background. Samuel moved through the room with his usual quiet efficiency, attending to the guests and ensuring that every detail was perfect. Catherine, playful and mischievous, found moments to engage him in conversation, her voice light yet deliberate, drawing attention without seeming inappropriate. Isabella, watching from across the room, felt a surge of possessiveness so strong that it caught her breath. She approached Samuel herself, engaging him in a task that required his focus and proximity, her tone casual yet infused with an intensity that Catherine could not ignore. The aftermath of that afternoon left both young women restless. Isabella's thoughts were consumed by Catherine's audacity, the way she had tested boundaries and drawn attention to herself. Catherine, meanwhile, reveled in the thrill of the unspoken contest, noting Isabella's subtle attempts to assert dominance while planning her own strategies for the days ahead. The shared secret had transformed into a battlefield of emotions, each girl navigating a delicate dance of desire, jealousy, and influence that grew increasingly fraught with complexity. The household staff, ever observant, began to sense the tension between the young women. Whispers circulated quietly among the servants, noting the unusual intensity of their interactions, the subtle rivalries that seemed to emerge during even the most mundane tasks, and the way Samuel's presence now carried an almost magnetic significance. While none dared speak openly of what was happening, the undercurrents of emote were palpable, shaping the atmosphere of the estate and influencing the behavior of all who lived within its walls. As the weeks progressed, the sparks of jealousy became more pronounced. Isabella found herself scrutinizing Catherine's every movement, analyzing her tone, her gestures, and her proximity to Samuel. Each perceived slight, whether intentional or accidental, was catalogued and weighed, feeding a growing sense of possessiveness and rivalry. Catherine, equally astute, responded with a combination of charm, defiance, and playful manipulation, testing the limits of Isabella's composure and subtly asserting her own influence. The dynamic between the two friends began to shape the very structure of their days. Conversations, walks through the gardens, and shared activities became arenas for subtle competition, each interaction layered with multiple meanings and unspoken rules. The sparks of jealousy were no longer fleeting. They had become a constant undercurrent, influencing decisions, moods, and the trajectory of the summer. Isabella, who had once moved through the estate with calm authority, now felt the weight of uncertainty and the unfamiliar sting of rivalry. Catherine, invigorated by the challenge, pushed boundaries in ways that were both thrilling and dangerous, testing not only Isabella's patience, but the very limits of propriety within the Montrose household. Even Samuel, unaware of the intensity his presence inspired, became an unwitting participant in this growing tension. His measured responses, polite deference, and quiet composure served to heighten the stakes, drawing the attention of both young women in ways that amplified their emotions. Each glance exchanged, each word spoken, became a subtle flashpoint, igniting feelings of jealousy, fascination, and possessiveness that neither Isabella nor Catherine could fully contain. The first open confrontation, though brief, marked a turning point. One crisp morning as they walked through the estate's orchard, Isabella's tone carried an edge she could not entirely disguise. Catherine, perceptive as always, noticed the subtle shift immediately. A conversation over Samuel's assistance with chores, seemingly innocuous, became loaded with tension. Words were chosen carefully, pauses calculated, glances exchanged with the precision of a silent duel. Though no raised voices erupted, the unspoken contest was palpable, leaving both girls aware that the stakes of their fascination had grown far higher than either had anticipated. From that moment onward, the sparks of jealousy evolved into a persistent flame, influencing the rhythm of the household, the moods of the young women, and the trajectory of their friendship. Each day brought new opportunities for subtle maneuvering, each interaction with Samuel a test of influence, and each private glance or gesture a potential spark of rivalry. The Montrose estate, outwardly serene and orderly, had become a stage for an invisible drama of emotion, desire, and power that neither Isabella nor Catherine could openly acknowledge. By the time the first frost dusted the fields of Virginia, the atmosphere in the Montrose household was taut with anticipation and unspoken tension. The sparks of jealousy that had ignited in late summer had grown into a quiet, simmering fire, one that shaped every conversation, glance, and action. Isabella and Catherine, bound together by friendship and fascination, were now caught in a delicate dance of rivalry and desire. Their shared secret transformed into a complex web of emotions that threatened to unravel at any moment. The stage was set for the next phase of their story. The sparks of jealousy, once subtle and contained, had grown into a force that would soon drive actions, decisions, and consequences far beyond what either young woman could anticipate. Samuel, silent and unaware, remained at the center, the fulcrum around which desire, possessiveness, and rivalry now pivoted. The Montrose estate, with its grandeur, its hidden corridors, and its careful routines, had become a theater of emotion, poised for the escalation that would soon define the lives of all involved. And so, as the Virginia winds carried the scent of fallen leaves and approaching winter, the sparks of jealousy flickered, glowing brighter with each passing day, setting the scene for the obsessions, conflicts, and tragic outcomes that were destined to follow. As winter crept over the Virginia hills, the Montrose estate seemed serene from the outside, a grand plantation draped in the soft white of early frost, smoke curling lazily from chimneys, and the distant hills muted under the pale sun. But inside, the carefully cultivated elegance of the house could not conceal the growing tension between Isabella Montrose and her lifelong friend Catherine Langley. What had begun as subtle curiosity about Samuel, the new addition to the estate, had evolved into a potent rivalry that now dominated their every interaction. The sparks of jealousy ignited during the late summer and early fall had grown into a persistent, simmering fire that neither girl could ignore, shaping not only their relationship with each other, but also the course of their lives in ways that were becoming increasingly dangerous. Isabella, who had always been composed and deliberate, now found her thoughts consumed by Catherine's presence and the subtle competition over Samuel's attention. She scrutinized Catherine's every word, every gesture, and every glance, cataloging the nuances that hinted at a claim she neither wanted to share nor could fully control. Her fascination with Samuel had never been merely physical or idle. It was bound to her sense of power, influence, and identity. The thought that Catherine, her closest friend and confidant, might rival her for his attention, stirred feelings of possessiveness that were both thrilling and terrifying. Catherine, in contrast, seemed invigorated by the escalation. She understood, as few did, the subtleties of social manipulation, charm, and observation. Rather than shy away from the competition, she leaned into it, testing Isabella's limits while exploring her own desires. Her actions, though playful on the surface, carried an undercurrent of calculated intent. She lingered near Samuel under the guise of conversation, allowed accidental touches while assisting with household tasks, and smiled in ways that suggested a confidence Isabella could not ignore. Each subtle move was a spark, feeding the growing rivalry and intensifying the emotional stakes between the two young women. The escalation was subtle at first, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, yet profoundly felt by all three individuals at the center of it. Isabella began to orchestrate situations that would place Samuel in her proximity while attempting to minimize Catherine's influence. She assigned him tasks that allowed for closer interaction, folding linens in her presence, assisting with her correspondence, and even walking with her through the estate grounds during the shorter winter days. Her tone in conversation became slightly more pointed, her attention slightly more deliberate, yet always maintaining the veneer of politeness and propriety, expected in a society obsessed with appearances. Catherine, however, was far from passive. She recognized Isabella's subtle maneuvers and responded with a mixture of charm, audacity, and playful defiance. She found excuses to spend time in the same rooms as Samuel, lingered longer during household activities, and occasionally spoke in a tone meant to draw Isabella's notice, lightly teasing, yet carefully measured. This silent contest became a delicate dance, where every glance, gesture, and word was loaded with meaning. The rivalry had grown beyond mere jealousy. It was now a game of influence, observation, and subtle domination, with Samuel unwittingly at the center. Even the household staff began to notice the shift. Whispered comments and exchanged glances among the servants reflected an awareness of the tension that permeated the Montrose home. They observed how Isabella and Catherine navigated the estate, noting the subtle competitions that arose over seemingly trivial interactions with Samuel. While they dared not speak openly, The undercurrents of rivalry shaped the rhythm of the household, influencing how tasks were delegated, how attention was distributed, and how even ordinary conversations were conducted. The presence of Samuel, once simply another servant, now carried a weight and significance that rippled through every corner of the estate. The rivalry escalated further during a winter gathering intended to celebrate the harvest and the social connections of the Montrose family. The drawing room was ablaze with candlelight, the soft murmur of conversation mingling with the faint strains of a harp. Guests from neighboring estates were in attendance, and the atmosphere was outwardly one of civility, warmth, and celebration. Yet, beneath the surface, Isabella and Catherine's competition had intensified to the point of open subtlety. Catherine's laughter rang out more freely than usual, a deliberate effort to draw attention to herself, and by extension Samuel. She found opportunities to engage him in conversation in ways that were public enough to be noticed, but subtle enough to avoid overt scandal. Isabella, sensing the challenge, responded in kind. She engaged Samuel in tasks that required careful attention, orchestrated moments where his eyes would meet hers, and subtly reminded Catherine of the boundaries that social decorum demanded. The air between the two friends was charged with unspoken conflict, their rivalry now observable to those attuned to such nuances, yet invisible to the casual observer. Private moments, however, were where the rivalry became most dangerous. The drawing room, the libraries, and the hidden corridors of the estate became stages for silent contests of influence. Isabella would ask Samuel to assist her in personal matters, arranging books, preparing notes, or tending to her personal correspondence. Catherine would find ways to be present in these same moments, offering assistance, asking questions, or engaging in casual conversation designed to test Isabella's patience and assert her own subtle control. Each interaction carried emotional weight, each glance became a potential flashpoint, and each gesture was carefully noted, catalogued, and countered in a delicate game that neither girl could openly acknowledge. The rivalry also began to manifest in the form of subtle manipulation. Isabella, accustomed to control, began to orchestrate situations to subtly isolate Catherine from Samuel. She would assign Catherine tasks that required her attention elsewhere, redirect conversations and engineer circumstances where Samuel's proximity favored herself. Catherine, perceptive and clever, responded by using charm, wit, and social intuition to circumvent these attempts, finding opportunities to maintain influence and attention, even under Isabella's careful orchestration. Their contest, silent yet potent, became a constant undercurrent, influencing decisions, moods, and even the way they interacted with the rest of the household. As the weeks progressed, the stakes of their rivalry intensified. The shared secret that had once bound them together in fascination had now transformed into a source of tension, competition, and subtle conflict. The Montrose estate, with its grandeur, ordered routines, and carefully maintained decorum, became a theater for an invisible drama that neither Isabella nor Catherine could openly address. Each day presented new opportunities for subtle victories, carefully measured influence, and quiet tests of patience and power. The rivalry had escalated beyond casual jealousy. It had become an emotional battlefield, with Samuel unwittingly at the center, and the rules of engagement ermined by social decorum, intuition, and desire. The first tangible signs of emotional strain emerged in their private conversations. Isabella, normally measured and deliberate, began to show flashes of impatience, subtle sharpness in tone, and carefully concealed irritation when Catherine's attention strayed too close to Samuel. Catherine, recognizing these cues, responded with playful defiance, testing boundaries in ways that were both exhilarating and infuriating. The friendship, once unshakable, now rested on a fragile balance of desire, control, and subtle manipulation, a balance that could tip with the slightest misstep. Even Samuel, diligent and polite, began to sense the subtle shifts in attention and energy between the two young women. Though he remained focused on his duties, he could not entirely ignore the charged atmosphere, the glances that lingered a moment too long, and the careful orchestration of proximity and conversation. His presence, once a neutral element in the Montrose household, had become the fulcrum of emotional tension, a silent participant in a rivalry that neither Isabella nor Catherine could openly articulate. By the time winter reached its peak, The rivalry had transformed from subtle sparks into a sustained, simmering force that influenced every facet of daily life on the estate. Isabella and Catherine, bound by friendship, fascination, and desire, were now locked in a delicate and dangerous contest of influence and control. The Montrose estate, with its grandeur, its hidden corridors, and its disciplined routines, had become both a sanctuary and a stage, a place where desire, jealousy, and obsession were played out in silence, shaping the behavior, thoughts, and emotions of all involved. The escalation of their rivalry set the stage for the inevitable consequences that would follow. What began as curiosity and fascination had grown into a powerful force, one that would soon drive actions, decisions, and events beyond the control of either young woman. Samuel, still unaware of the full extent of their emotions, remained at the center, the unwitting catalyst for a conflict that would only intensify in the months to come. The Montrose estate, outwardly serene and orderly, now simmered with invisible tension, its halls and corridors bearing silent witness to a rivalry that threatened to consume not only their friendship, but their entire social world. And so, as the Virginia landscape lay under a blanket of frost, the rivalry between Isabella and Catherine escalated, fueled by desire, jealousy, and the subtle manipulations of two young women who had once been inseparable. The invisible drama had become a living force, shaping their days, their interactions, and the destiny of everyone within the Montrose household. The stage was set, the tension high, and the inevitable climax, one driven by obsession, jealousy, and human desire, was already beginning to take form. By the time the first snow of winter began to dust, the Virginia hills, the simmering tension between Isabella Montrose and Catherine Langley, had reached an unbearable peak. What had begun as subtle fascination with Samuel, the young enslaved man at the Montrose estate, had escalated into a rivalry that now consumed their thoughts, dictated their actions, and colored every interaction. The invisible games of attention and influence that had occupied their summer and fall had evolved into an emotional battlefield, and it was only a matter of time before the pressure erupted into something far more dangerous. The estate itself, with its grand halls and shadowed corridors, seemed to pulse with the weight of unspoken emotions. Isabella moved through the rooms with the same careful grace that had always defined her, yet beneath the surface, her mind was a storm of possessiveness, jealousy, and simmering resentment. Catherine, perceptive and audacious, moved alongside her with a similar mixture of charm, mischief, and determination. Both young women understood the stakes, yet neither could temper the escalating intensity of their rivalry. Each glance, each gesture, each word exchanged in the presence of Samuel became a spark, threatening to ignite the combustible mixture of desire and jealousy that now dominated their lives. The first incident that hinted at the coming tragedy occurred during a private evening in the drawing room. Snow fell softly outside the tall windows, and the flickering fire cast dancing shadows across the polished wood and elegant furnishings. Samuel had been tasked with arranging firewood and attending to the smaller details of the room, yet his presence had become the focal point of attention for both young women. Isabella, seated gracefully near the hearth, observed him with a mixture of fascination and possessiveness. Catherine, leaning casually against a nearby table, did the same, her eyes tracing the contours of his movements, her mind alive with curiosity and desire. At first, the interactions were subtle, a lingering glance here, a softly spoken word there, but the intensity had grown to a level where restraint was difficult to maintain. A careless brush of Samuel's hand against Catherine's as he passed by set off a ripple of tension in Isabella. Her breath caught, and she felt the first true sting of fear that her carefully cultivated influence, the attention she had so deliberately guided, might be usurped by her closest friend. Catherine, sensing Isabella's subtle reaction, allowed herself a small, triumphant smile, a gesture that ignited a flash of anger and jealousy in Isabella. The rivalry escalated rapidly over the next few days. Isabella began to orchestrate interactions with Samuel that left Catherine on the margins, assigning him tasks that required proximity to herself, engaging him in conversation that drew his focus, and subtly asserting control over his attention. Catherine, far from discouraged, responded with defiance, using charm, playful teasing, and subtle manipulation to regain influence. The unspoken contest became increasingly heated, each girl testing the other, probing limits, and exploring the boundaries of desire, control, and rivalry. The household, as always, remained outwardly composed, Servants moved silently through the halls, observing the tension with quiet curiosity and subtle concern, yet even they could sense the intensity that now permeated the Montrose estate. Samuel, still dutiful and polite, began to feel the weight of the emotional currents swirling around him, though he could not fully comprehend their origin. He continued to perform his tasks with grace and precision, yet the glances, gestures, and unspoken contests of his mistresses began to color his every interaction, adding a tension that had previously been absent from the household. The breaking point came one bitterly cold afternoon. Isabella had invited Samuel to assist her in preparing the library for a small gathering of the family and select guests. Catherine, aware of the planned interaction, followed closely, her presence deliberate and unavoidable. Samuel, caught between the two young women, moved with careful attention, unaware of the magnitude of the tension he had helped create. The library, with its tall shelves and flickering firelight, became a stage for confrontation, a private arena where the simmering jealousy that had been building for months could no longer be contained. Words were exchanged, brief, sharp, and carefully measured, but the underlying emotion was unmistakable. Isabella, unable to contain the possessiveness that had been growing inside her, issued a subtle reprimand when Catherine drew too close to Samuel. Catherine, emboldened by her audacity and unwilling to yield, responded with defiance, her tone teasing yet pointed. The exchange, though outwardly polite, carried the weight of months of rivalry, jealousy, and unspoken desire. Each sentence was a calculated move, each glance a silent strike, and the tension in the room was nearly tangible. The confrontation escalated beyond words. In a moment of impulsive emotion, Isabella reached out to remove an object Samuel had handed to Catherine, a gesture that was interpreted as both possession and control. Catherine, equally impassioned, attempted to assert her own influence, and the resulting clash, though brief, left all three individuals shaken. Samuel, startled by the sudden tension and the uncharacteristic behavior of the young women, stepped back, his calm composure momentarily disrupted. The emotional stakes of the rivalry had reached a point where reason and social propriety were no longer sufficient to contain the intensity of their feelings. From that moment on, the atmosphere in the Montrose estate became increasingly strained. The rivalry, once subtle and strategic, now erupted in moments of tension, silent standoffs, and sharp exchanges. Isabella, consumed by jealousy and the need to maintain control, began to act with greater urgency, orchestrating encounters and interactions that would keep Samuel in her immediate presence. Catherine, equally determined, continued to challenge these maneuvers, using charm, wit, and calculated defiance to draw attention and assert influence. The unspoken game had transformed into a series of confrontations, each one more intense than the last. The consequences of a conflict he could not have anticipated, the shared secret, the rivalry, and the sparks of jealousy had culminated in a catastrophe that no one could undo. In the weeks that followed, the Montrose estate struggled to reconcile the outward appearance of order with the emotional devastation that had unfolded within its walls. Isabella, once poised and commanding, was now haunted by grief, guilt, and the memory of the rivalry that had escalated beyond control. Samuel, still present in the household, carried with him the silent weight of witnessing a tragedy that had erupted from the interplay of desire, jealousy, and human obsession, and the Montrose estate itself, a place of grandeur and tradition, bore the invisible scars of a conflict that had begun as fascination and rivalry, and ended in irreversible tragedy. The events of that winter became a cautionary tale whispered in private corners of Virginia society, a story of obsession, jealousy, and the dangerous consequences of unrestrained desire. Isabella's life, forever marked by the tragedy, was a reminder of the fragile line between fascination and possessiveness, between friendship and rivalry, and between curiosity and destructive obsession. Samuel, the unwitting center of the conflict, remained a figure of silent consequence, a reminder of the human cost of desire and the unpredictability of passion when left unchecked. The tragedy that struck the Montrose estate was not merely an accident, it was the inevitable outcome of months of simmering tension, unspoken rivalry, and the invisible games of influence and desire that had consumed Isabella and Catherine. It was a stark demonstration of how quickly fascination could evolve into obsession, how subtle sparks of jealousy could ignite into catastrophe, and how the interplay of human emotions, social constraints, and forbidden desires could shape destinies in ways that no one could foresee. The tragedy that struck the Montrose estate left an indelible mark on everyone involved, shaping their lives and the future of the household in ways that no one could have foreseen. The accident that claimed Catherine Langley's life during the bitter Virginia winter was more than a single catastrophic moment. It was the culmination of months of simmering tension, jealousy, and rivalry. Its aftermath rippled through the Montrose family, the servants, and the wider community, creating a legacy defined by grief, guilt, and the haunting memory of desire turned destructive. In the immediate weeks following the incident, Isabella Montrose was consumed by a complex mixture of grief, shame, and guilt. Though the act that caused Catherine's death was not premeditated, the realization that her own emotions, her jealousy, possessiveness, and subtle manipulations, had contributed to the fatal confrontation weighed heavily on her. She retreated from the social engagements that had once defined her life, withdrawing into the private spaces of the estate where she could be alone with her thoughts and the memory of her lost friend. Each room of Montrose now bore the silent echoes of that fateful day: the drawing room with its toppled candelabra, the library where confrontations had escalated, and the corridors where glances and gestures had once carried hidden meaning. Isabella's transformation was profound. The young woman who had once moved through the world with poise, confidence, and social authority now navigated life with a careful, almost fearful deliberation. She became acutely aware of the consequences of her emotions, of the fragility of relationships, and of the dangerous power of jealousy and obsession. Friends and family noted the change. Her laughter, once effortless and warm, now rare, her interactions, measured and cautious. The Montrose estate, outwardly unchanged, had become a repository of her grief, a place where every object and corner served as a reminder of what had been lost and what could never be regained. Samuel, the young enslaved man who had been at the center of the rivalry, was also deeply affected. Though he had always approached his duties with calm dignity and discretion, he could not ignore the tragedy that had unfolded around him. He witnessed firsthand the consequences of human desire, the destructive potential of rivalry, and the fragility of life when emotions are left unchecked. In the days following Catherine's death, Samuel's interactions with Isabella shifted subtly. He remained polite, attentive, and diligent in his work, yet there was a quiet gravity to his demeanor, a silent acknowledgement of the events that had occurred and their irreversible impact on the household. The other servants, too, were not untouched by the tragedy. Though they had been accustomed to the strict hierarchies of the estate and the nuanced behaviors of the young mistresses, the events of that winter shattered the illusion of control. Whispers circulated through the corridors, reflecting fear, curiosity, and a somber awareness of the fragility of human emotion. Samuel's central role in the household, once defined by service and obedience, now carried a more complex significance. He had become, unwittingly, a witness to a tragedy that underscored the hidden tensions beneath the veneer of elegance and order. As the months passed, the Montrose family struggled to reconcile outward appearances with internal grief. Social engagements continued, letters were exchanged with neighboring estates, and the rhythms of plantation life persisted. Yet beneath the surface, the shadow of Catherine's death lingered, shaping decisions, conversations, and the behavior of those who lived at Montrose. Isabella's retreat from public life became more pronounced, her thoughts often occupied by reflections on jealousy, desire, and the delicate balance of human relationships. The shared secret that had once bound Isabella and Catherine in fascination had transformed into a painful lesson on the company. And sequences of unbridled emotion. In the wider community, the incident became a topic of hushed conversation and speculation. The story of the Virginia heiress, her best friend, and the tragic accident spread quietly through social circles, though details were often obscured or softened in retelling. Catherine's death was regarded with a mixture of sympathy and caution, a tale that highlighted the dangers of jealousy, rivalry, and unchecked emotion. Isabella, though shielded by her family's status and wealth, became a figure of fascination herself. A young woman marked by tragedy, whose beauty and composure were now inseparable from the memory of a fatal rivalry. The legacy of the tragedy extended beyond social perception. For Isabella, it became a source of introspection and, eventually, transformation. The intense rivalry, the shared secret, and the obsession that had defined her interactions with Catherine and Samuel forced her to confront the darker aspects of her own nature. She became more introspective, cautious in her relationships, and acutely aware of the consequences of desire and jealousy. Over time, this self-awareness shaped her approach to both personal and social interactions, instilling in her a sense of humility, restraint, and reflection that had been absent in her younger years. Samuel's role in the aftermath was more complex. While the young man continued to fulfill his duties with diligence, the events of that winter altered the dynamics of his relationship with Isabella. Though he remained a silent witness to her grief and transformation, the intensity of the past interactions could not be erased. Samuel's presence became a quiet reminder of the fragile interplay between human desire, social hierarchy, and the potential for conflict. His dignity, patience, and resilience became essential to maintaining the stability of the household, and his quiet influence shaped the recovery of the estate in ways that were subtle yet profound. The Montrose estate itself bore the marks of the tragedy. Though the grand hall's polished floors and elegant furnishings remained intact, the emotional atmosphere of the household had shifted permanently. The spaces that had once been arenas for subtle rivalry, the drawing room, the library, the gardens, now carried a weight of memory and reflection. The estate became a symbol not only of wealth and social standing, but also of the hidden consequences of human desire, the fragility of relationships, and the enduring impact of loss. In the years that followed, Isabella gradually emerged from her period of withdrawal. Though she was forever changed, her interactions became measured, her friendships approached with care, and her curiosity tempered by the knowledge of what unbridled fascination and jealousy could lead to. The tragedy had instilled in her a cautious respect for the emotional lives of others, and a profound understanding of the consequences of actions driven by desire and obsession. She continued to navigate the complex social world of Virginia's elite. She did so with a tempered grace, shaped by memory, loss, and hard-earned wisdom. The legacy of Catherine Langley also endured. Though her life had been cut tragically short, her presence continued to influence the Montrose household and its inhabitants. The shared secret, the rivalry, and the fascination that had defined her relationship with Isabella and Samuel became cautionary lessons, whispered reminders of the delicate balance between desire and control, fascination and obsession. Catherine's memory, preserved in the corridors of Montrose, and in the consciousness of those who had known her, remained a poignant symbol of the fragility of human emotion and the irreversible consequences of rivalry left unchecked. For Samuel, the aftermath was quieter but no less significant. His experience at Montrose had exposed him to the intricate, often dangerous dynamics of human desire, jealousy, and obsession. Though he remained bound by the limitations imposed by slavery, he navigated his role with increased awareness and subtle authority, understanding that his presence carried a weight beyond mere service. His dignity and composure became a stabilizing force within the estate, a quiet counterbalance to the emotional turbulence that had once dominated the household. Ultimately, the tragedy at the Montrose estate became a story of human complexity, a testament to the interplay between desire, jealousy, friendship, and social constraint. It revealed how fascination could evolve into obsession, how subtle sparks of rivalry could ignite into catastrophic consequences, and how the delicate balance of relationships could be shattered by the intensity of human emotion. The Montrose estate, once a symbol of elegance, order, and privilege, became a living testament to the lessons of restraint, reflection, and the enduring impact of loss. In the decades that followed, the story of Isabella, Catherine, and Samuel continued to echo through Virginia society, not as gossip, but as a cautionary tale. Families would whisper of the young heiress, the best friend, and the tragic winter in which jealousy and desire collided with irreversible force. The Montrose estate itself, preserved and maintained, stood as a reminder that beneath the polished floors, the grand halls, and the cultivated gardens, the human heart remained vulnerable to the most powerful and unpredictable forces: love, fascination, and envy. The legacy of that fateful winter was thus twofold. For Isabella, it became a lifelong lesson in humility, self-awareness, and emotional restraint. For Samuel, it was a reminder of the invisible weight carried by those who are caught at the center of human desire. And for the Montrose estate, it was a silent chronicle of passion, rivalry, and the enduring consequences of unchecked emotion. A story etched into its walls, its corridors, and the very fabric of its history. Through the years, the memory of Catherine Langley lingered, not merely as a tragic figure, but as a catalyst for understanding, reflection, and the complex interplay of friendship, obsession, and human vulnerability. Isabella's life, though forever shadowed by grief, carried the wisdom born of tragedy. And Samuel, a silent observer and participant, continued to navigate the delicate boundaries of service, observation, and humanity, leaving a legacy defined not by tragedy alone, but by the resilience, dignity, and quiet strength that had shaped him in the aftermath. The Montrose estate, frozen in time yet alive with the echoes of the past, remained a testament to the enduring power of human emotion, the love, jealousy, fascination, and rivalry that shape destinies and leave their mark on history. And so, even decades later, the story of the Virginia heiress, her best friend, and the young enslaved man, who unwittingly became the center of desire and tragedy, continued to resonate, a somber reminder of the lessons learned too late, the consequences of unchecked passion, and the enduring complexity of the human heart.